By 1986, the Wishbone had produced untold success. 8 national champions, a Heisman Trophy, multiple NCAA records and historic winning streaks. But the chess match moves forward. Teams still saw the success of the Wishbone and wanted a piece, but with opposite strategies. Some teams were seeking a way to minimize the talent gap between them and other teams, while other teams were hoping to maximize it. And one team set out to bring the Wishbone down. Coming off its greatest season in school history, the Falcons had to rebuild. Air Force graduated 30 seniors from their 12-1 team, and it showed. Air Force dropped from 3rd in the nation in scoring to 65th. The Falcons salvaged a winning record at 6-5, but missed a bowl game for the first time in 5 seasons. In '87, Dee Dowis took the helm for the Falcons after replacing Steve Letnich during a 27-13 loss to Wyoming. After that, however, Dowis and the Falcons won 5 straight, culminating in a win over Navy. After losses to Notre Dame and BYU, Air Force ended the regular season with 3 straight wins, including a win over Army, securing the Commander-in-Chief trophy. Air Force was invited to the Freedom Bowl to take on Arizona State. Dowis would miss the game with a broken wrist, so Letnich would take the reins. Air Force struck first on a touchdown run by Greg Johnson, but ASU tied it up on an 11-play touchdown drive. In the second half, Air Force struggled to move the ball and fell behind 33-14. Late in the game, when it was all but out of hand, Air Force, led by backup quarterback Lance McDowell, scored 2 late touchdowns to make Arizona State sweat, but ultimately fell 33-28. In '88, the Falcons once again had an effective offense, finishing 8th in the country in scoring, but finished 5-7, ending the season on a 5-game losing streak, their first losing season since 1981. Air Force was back to their winning ways in '89, and with Dowis back for his 3rd year as a starter, the Falcons' offense was once again near the top of the nation in scoring. They started the year 6-0, culminating in a win over Navy, before dropping games to Notre Dame and TCU. They secured the Commander-in-Chief trophy before dropping a close one to number 21 BYU. After a win at Utah, the Falcons tied number 23 Hawaii 35-35. Once again, they were going bowling, but once again, they'd come away with a loss, this time to Ole Miss in the Liberty Bowl. Even so, it was a historic season for Air Force, as quarterback Dee Dowis finished the season with 1,000 yards rushing and passing, only the 5th player to do so. Dowis finished his career with 3,612 rushing yards, an NCAA record for quarterbacks which would stand until 2001. He also set the WAC record for rushing yards in a game by a quarterback with 249. As a team, Air Force finished 6th in the country in scoring, averaging 37 points a game. After Dowis's graduation, Air Force went 7-5 in 1990 with another program-defining win, this time over Ohio State in the Liberty Bowl. 1991 saw the Falcons win 10 games, including another Liberty Bowl win, this time against Mississippi State. Quarterback Rob Perez rushed for over 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns, while 5 other players gained over 350 yards rushing apiece. Over the years, Air Force maintained a fairly high standard of success and would incorporate more and more Flexbone into their system until, by 1995, the Wishbone had been phased out completely. On the East Coast, another academy started using Air Force's blueprint. In 1983, West Point hired Jim Young as head coach. After going 2-9 in his first year, Young switched to the Wishbone and shuffled his personnel so much that nobody in the backfield had ever started a game at their position. But Young knew what he was doing, as 3 players went over the 100-yard mark in Army's season opener. In Week 2, Army was a 20-point underdog to Tennessee, but with time running out, the Cadets drove 80 yards to score and secure a 24-24 tie. In Week 8, the defense put the clamps on Air Force's Wishbone, winning 24-12. After splitting their next 2 games, Army met Navy in Philly. A win would clinch the Commander-in-Chief trophy. It was Army's first win over Navy in 7 years. The Cadets picked up an invitation to the Cherry Bowl where they'd play Michigan State. Army would win the slugfest 10-6 and finish the season with a record of 8-3-1, their first winning season since 1977. The season was a resounding success. The Cadets improved their win total from 2-83 to 8-84. They led the nation in rushing. They set a school record with 628 rushing yards in a single game and had 4 players break the 100-yard mark in that game. Army had 2 1,000-yard rushers, one of whom was quarterback Nate Sassaman, who became the first major college quarterback to break the 1,000-yard barrier since Oklahoma's Jack Mildren in 1971. Army also earned their first bowl invitation in school history, and won. After the season, Jim Young called it the best team he'd ever coached. But Young and Army were just getting started as the Cadets finished 8th in scoring offense in '85. They started that season 5-0, averaging 43 points per game. While their performance earned them a spot in the AP Top 20, they lost the next week to Notre Dame. After 2 more wins, Air Force, in the middle of their historic season, showed Army how to really run the bone, beating them 45-7. Despite a season-ending loss to Navy, the Cadets were invited to the Peach Bowl to take on their second Big Ten team in as many years, and they'd pick up their second bowl win in as many years, beating Illinois 31-29. The '85 team excelled when it came to distribution, as 5 players gained over 500 rushing yards apiece. Army ranked 8th in the country in scoring and tied a school record with 9 wins. Army went 6-5 in 1986, marking the first time Army had had 3 winning seasons in a row in 23 years. After a 5-6 year in '87, the Cadets were back to their winning ways in '88. Army started the season 8-1, with their only loss coming to number 17 Washington in Week 2. After dropping a game to Boston College, Army won a close battle with Navy, securing the Commander-in-Chief trophy and giving them a chance to set a new school record for wins in a season, as the 9-2 Cadets would face off against 20th-ranked Alabama in the Sun Bowl. But Army couldn't overcome the magnificent passing attack of Alabama's David Smith, falling to the Crimson Tide 29-28. Army would go 6-5 in each of the next 2 years, and Young would retire after the 1990 season. His successor, Bob Sutton, would continue to run the Wishbone. By 1994, the Cadets were incorporating flexbone concepts and, like Air Force, were no longer really a Wishbone team. In the Southwest Conference, nobody had run the Wishbone since Texas A&M fired Emory Bellard in 1978. But in 1984, Arkansas hired Ken Hatfield away from Air Force. Hatfield, who had played at Arkansas, implemented the Wishbone along with some flexbone concepts. But the Hogs passed a remarkable 211 times in 1984 because of star receiver James Shebest, who caught 51 passes for 907 yards that year. Passing would become a hallmark of Hatfield's Wishbone at Arkansas. Arkansas finished with a 7-4-1 record that year, ending the season with a loss in the Liberty Bowl to another Wishbone team, Bo Jackson and Auburn. The next season, the Razorbacks showed marked improvement, going 10-2 with a win over Arizona State in the Holiday Bowl. In 1986 and '87, Arkansas went 9-3 and 9-4 respectively. While winning 9 games is nice, it was clear that Arkansas was not elite. They had gotten demolished by Miami 51-7 in 1987. What fans really wanted was to take the next step and win a conference championship in a big-time bowl game. 1988 looked to be the year. The season started off shaky as the Hogs eked out a 30-26 win against Tulsa in Week 2. But the Razorbacks were still undefeated coming into their October matchup with Texas. Arkansas used a multifaceted attack to take an early lead and held on for the victory, showing they had more than just the Wishbone in their repertoire. After winning their next 3 conference games, they had 1 hurdle left before they could call themselves champions: Texas A&M. Once again, the Razorbacks built a significant lead before A&M started coming back. Arkansas recovered an Aggie onside kick to make themselves victors and champions of the Southwest Conference. Their last game of the season would be against Jimmy Johnson's Hurricanes, but the 10-0 Hogs wouldn't be swept away this year. After Miami took a 10-3 lead, it only took Arkansas 1 play to even the score as Barry Foster housed it from 80 yards out. Miami tacked on a field goal before Arkansas retook the lead on a touchdown pass to Foster, but the 2-point conversion was no good. Those 2 points would prove to be the difference as the Hurricanes kicked a fourth-quarter field goal and survived the Razorbacks 18-16. As Southwest Conference champions, Arkansas earned the right to face UCLA in the Cotton Bowl in a clash of top 10 teams. But the Bruins held Arkansas's Wishbone in check, winning 17-3. After 1988, Hatfield's Hogs went away from the Wishbone, implementing the option from the I formation. After another Southwest Conference title in '89, Hatfield left Arkansas for Clemson. The Big Eight had long been the home of college football's longest-lasting and most successful Wishbone team, the Oklahoma Sooners. But in 1985, another team entered the fray. Colorado had been a team down on its luck. From 1980 to '84, they finished last or second to last in the Big Eight every year. In 1982, CU hired Bill McCartney to replace Chuck Fairbanks, whom you might remember from his OU days. Fairbanks had left the Colorado program in shambles. It wouldn't be easy for McCartney to clean up the mess. In fact, McCartney was 7-25-1 in his first 3 years, but the Buffs' patience paid off. Because in 1985, McCartney began an incredible turnaround. His secret? You guessed it, the Wishbone. After running a pass-heavy offense his first 3 years in Boulder, he sent coordinator Jerry DiNardo to meet with Fisher DeBerry, Ken Hatfield, and former Oklahoma assistant Larry Lacewell to learn the offense. Halfback Mark Hatcher was moved to quarterback prior to the season, and they were off to the races. Colorado started 2-0, already doubling 1984's win total. After taking a predictable loss in Week 3 to Ohio State, the Buffs got back on track by beating an Arizona team that would finish 8-3-1. CU was officially a contender. They started conference play by beating Missouri and Iowa State by a combined score of 78-13. On October 26th, 5-1 Colorado faced off with rival Nebraska, also 5-1. But the Huskers showed Colorado that they weren't ready for the big time yet, beating the Buffs 17-7. They would finish the season with a win over Kansas State and a loss to Washington in the Freedom Bowl, Colorado's first bowl game since 1976. They had gone from 1 win to 7, from last in the country in rushing to 9th, from last in the Big Eight standings to 3rd. The beginning of 1986 made the previous season's success look like a flash in the pan as Colorado went winless in the non-conference slate. But in conference play, it was as if an entirely different team showed up. The Buffs went 6-1 in Big Eight play, including a win over number 3 Nebraska. Colorado secured a Bluebonnet Bowl berth, but lost to 14th-ranked Baylor. 1987 showed that the Buffs' improvement was for real as they went 7-4. While it was an improvement, they lost to all 3 ranked teams on their schedule, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. In '88, Colorado went undefeated in non-conference play, including a 24-21 nail-biter at 19th-ranked Iowa. However, Colorado once again couldn't get over the hump in the Big Eight, losing to the same 3 ranked teams that they lost to in '87. While Colorado improved their points per game totals every year since introducing the Wishbone, it seemed the Buffaloes had hit their ceiling. More devastating than those losses, however, was the startling revelation that their starting quarterback had inoperable stomach cancer. Sal Anesi, who had helped lead Colorado's resurgence over the past 2 seasons, played his last game in the Freedom Bowl on December 29, 1988. He would die in September 1989. The Buffaloes dedicated the '89 season to their departed signal caller, and had Anesi lived to see it, he would have been pleased with the result. Colorado finally broke through in 1989, going undefeated in the regular season. The Buffs boasted a 3-headed monster in the backfield to lead them to the promised land, but the real secret sauce was a schematic change that revolutionized triple-option football: the Ibone. First implemented in 1988, its full potential wouldn't be realized until 1989. Originally invented by a veterinary allergenist, yes, you heard that right, named James Smith, the Ibone was a take on the Wishbone that added unpredictability. Smith had been a walk-on quarterback at Texas A&M under Emory Bellard and knew triple-option football and felt the Wishbone could be improved upon. For example, whereas in the Wishbone a great running back was limited in what side of the field he could attack, the Ibone made it so that he could attack either side of the field. According to Smith, you could run all the concepts of the Wishbone, veer, and I formations out of the Ibone, making it a devastating weapon. And in 1989, quarterback Darian Hagan and company turned it into just that. The Buffs showed they were for real, defeating Texas and ranked Illinois and Washington teams before running roughshod over the Big Eight. but ran into a stout Notre Dame team whose only loss was to eventual national champion Miami. 1989 was the first time in 28 seasons that the Buffs had beaten both Oklahoma and Nebraska in the same season. The Big Red ceiling was finally broken, and Colorado stood atop the Big Eight. Quarterback Darian Hagan and running back Eric Bieniemy were back for 1990. That season, the Buffaloes went all in, as 4 of their 5 non-conference games were against ranked teams. It was do or die. After starting the season with 1 win, 1 loss, and 1 tie, the Buffs kicked it into high gear, beating ranked Texas and Washington teams, before the infamous 5th down. In a game that Hagan didn't start, the Buffs nevertheless produced points, but of course, not without controversy. In one of the biggest botched calls of all time, the refs gave Colorado a 5th down near the goal line in the closing seconds, and the Buffs took advantage, sealing a 33-31 win. Awaiting them in the Orange Bowl was the team that had ruined their national championship hopes the previous year, Notre Dame, but at the end of a mistake-filled slugfest, the Buffaloes emerged as national champions. Colorado wasn't the most dominant team to win a championship. They benefited a great deal from good fortune in 1990, but national champions they were, thanks to McCartney's switch to the Wishbone, then to the Ibone. Colorado posted an 8-win season in 1991 before McCartney switched to a one-back system for the 92 season. He'd coach at Colorado through 94, going out on a high note with an 11-1 season before retiring. McCartney retired as the winningest head coach in Colorado history with an all-time record of 93, 55, and 5, including a record of 20 and 15 while running the Wishbone and a record of 38, 9, and 2 while running the Ibone. After the Sooners won the national championship in 1985 behind Jamelle Holloway, Troy Aikman could see the writing on the wall. He wouldn't start again in an Oklahoma uniform, so the talented gunslinger transferred to UCLA. In 1986, the Sooners brought back Holloway and tight end Keith Jackson. Oklahoma started out with a bang, demolishing number 4 UCLA 38-3. In Game 3, however, Oklahoma would fall to Miami on the road. The Sooners fell behind 21-3, and in spite of a remarkable touchdown pass to Jackson, who ran over defender Benny Blades, the Sooners couldn't come back from behind and fell 28-16. The loss was the wake-up call the Sooners needed, as they beat their next 7 opponents by an average score of 47-4, setting up another showdown with Nebraska with the Big 8 title on the line. Nebraska struck first, but Oklahoma struck right back as a Keith Jackson catch led to a Holloway touchdown run. It wouldn't be the last time Jackson made a mark on the game. After a long punt return put the Huskers in striking distance, Steve Taylor's touchdown pass gave Nebraska a 17-7 lead. It looked like they had the Wishbone bottled up. But late in the fourth quarter, trailing 17-10, the Sooners began the 2-minute drill. Holloway completed passes to Carl Cabanis and Derek Shepard. The drive culminated in a touchdown pass to Keith Jackson. It looked like Oklahoma would come from behind to pull off an improbable tie. But for Jackson, a tie wasn't good enough. After 3 Nebraska plays that took no time off the clock, Oklahoma got the ball back with 50 seconds left. And Sooner magic made an appearance.
Passes away, and Jackson makes a spectacular catch and is knocked out of bounds at the 14-yard line.
Jackson's one-handed grab put OU in position for the victory that had seemed impossible less than 5 minutes of game time ago. OU smashed 9th-ranked Arkansas in the Orange Bowl to finish 11-1 and ranked 3rd in the AP poll. In 1987, the Sooners started the season number 1 overall. They returned Holloway, Jackson, a stable of backs, a mauling offensive line, and a number 1 defense. The Sooners blew through the first 8 games of their schedule, scoring an average of 52 points per game, while their opponents scored a total of 52 points during that stretch. Opponent 9 was 12th-ranked Oklahoma State, with Mike Gundy at the helm and Thurman Thomas and Barry Sanders carrying the ball. The Sooners won 29-10, but lost Jamelle Holloway to an ACL tear. After scraping by Missouri, which caused OU to drop to number 2 in the polls, the Sooners were 10-0 with one big obstacle left: undefeated and top-ranked Nebraska. Billed as the game of the century, too, the Sooners and Huskers seemed inseparable on paper. Nebraska was number 1, Oklahoma was number 2. Nebraska had the top-ranked offense, Oklahoma's was second. The one edge Nebraska had was that Jamelle Holloway was out. His backup, however, a freshman named Charles Thompson, was somehow faster than Holloway was. but could he run the bone? He proved himself capable as the Sooners moved the ball up and down the field, but OU couldn't punch it in and trailed 7-0 at the half. In the third quarter, a Ricky Dixon interception put OU on Nebraska's doorstep, and the Sooners took advantage and tied the game at 7. A long run by Patrick Collins gave OU the lead, and a field goal gave OU its final cushion as the Sooners won 17-7. It was back to the Orange Bowl to face Miami for the third time in 3 years, this time with everything on the line. Miami struck quickly, scoring on their first drive thanks to a Steve Walsh touchdown pass. The Sooners nickel and dimed their way down the field to tie the game just before halftime. After a 56-yard field goal, Walsh hit Michael Irvin to extend Miami's lead to 10. Another field goal made it 20-7, and the Sooners were running out of time, so they pulled out all the stops. A halfback pass and a fumble Ruski closed the gap to 6. The Sooners would get the ball back with 56 seconds left, but a fumble ended any hope the Sooners had of a second national title in 3 years. In 3 seasons, the Sooners had lost only 3 games. All 3 were to Miami. The secret lay in Jimmy Johnson's defense. The Miami 4-3 defense was designed specifically to stop the Wishbone. Johnson saw Oklahoma's Wishbone while head coach at Oklahoma State, but didn't have the athletes to stop it. Now, at Miami, he had not only the plan, but the players in place as well. What Johnson did was recruit safeties and play them at outside linebacker, and recruit linebackers and play them at defensive end. If you could put weight on them without losing speed, you had a perfect recipe for stopping the Wishbone. And it worked. Up to this point, nobody could consistently stop Oklahoma's bone because of their speed. Finally, someone could match it. In 1988, Oklahoma returned Holloway, Thompson, and a good stable of backs, but had to replace Keith Jackson and 4 offensive linemen. In total, Oklahoma lost 13 players to the NFL draft, and it showed. USC manhandled Oklahoma in Week 3, 23-7, but Oklahoma still had everything to play for. Oklahoma won their next 7 games, including a 31-28 classic against Oklahoma State. Throughout the season, a quarterback controversy had been brewing. It was clear that Jamelle Holloway wasn't the same player he was before his knee injury, but he was a better decision-maker than Thompson. Thompson's athletic ability, however, would be necessary to beat the best teams in the country. He had also just led the Sooners to a big victory over Mike Gundy and Barry Sanders' Oklahoma State Cowboys. But Nebraska was a different animal. The Huskers scored on their first drive. It would be the only touchdown scored by either team. The 2 turnover-happy offenses mustered a total of 10 points as Oklahoma lost 7-3. It was the fewest points Oklahoma had scored since 1983 when they were running the Power I. Holloway would get the start for the Sooners in the Citrus Bowl against Clemson, but it wasn't the finale that he was hoping for as Clemson won 13-6. Nevertheless, Holloway would finish with more wins than any Sooner quarterback with the exception of Steve Davis. Much greater than the quarterback controversy was another storm brewing within the program. Rumors swirled about players breaking NCAA rules and receiving special treatment. Switzer was accused of running a loose ship, but that proved to be the least of Oklahoma's worries. What brought the King's Castle crashing down was the arrest of 5 Sooners on felony charges, including quarterback Charles Thompson. Amidst NCAA allegations and his players' felony charges, Barry Switzer resigned before the '89 season. It was the end of an era. Oklahoma was the last great team to run the Wishbone. Arkansas and Colorado also departed from the bone after '88, putting a period on a part of college football history. No Wishbone team would ever contend on a national level again. The bone would be used as a change-up situationally, but not as a primary offense. Instead, it became a gimmick, a way to level the playing field if your team wasn't as good at passing or you had roster disadvantages like, say, a military academy. Jim Young switched to the Wishbone at Army for this very reason. Rather than a big play offense run by elite teams, it was becoming an equalizer, a way to minimize disadvantages. The game plan was no longer explosiveness, but ball control. And to this day, that's why the military academies run the flexbone. After the 80s, Colorado won a national championship in 1990 running the Ibone. Oregon State tried the Wishbone for a brief period in the mid-90s. Notre Dame would have it in their playbook as late as 2000. And Ken Hatfield would run a lot of broken bone as the head coach at Rice, while the military academies would continue to run it until it was completely replaced with the flexbone, which they still run today with success, demonstrating that there's still a place for old-school option offense in college football. It's possible the Wishbone hadn't really run its course as an offense. Some of the numbers Oklahoma put up in the late 80s are truly massive. In 1986, they beat Missouri 77-0, rushing for 681 yards and averaging 10.1 yards per play. In 1988, they put up 829 yards on Kansas State, 768 of them on the ground, still an NCAA record. Going over 500 rushing yards wasn't uncommon. The Sooners led the nation in scoring offense in both 86 and 87. It was off-the-field issues that killed Switzer's Wishbone, not a lack of on-the-field success. The only team that beat Oklahoma from 85 to 87 was the only team that could match or exceed Oklahoma's talent. There was nothing wrong with the scheme itself. It took absolutely elite speed to bring the Wishbone down. The legacy of the Wishbone lives on, thanks to the players and coaches who ran it. Major Ogilvy, Bo Jackson, Billy Sims, the only Wishbone player to ever win a Heisman. The offense defined the careers of some of the best coaches in college football history. Bear Bryant was a Hall of Famer before switching to the Wishbone, but after making Alabama a Wishbone team, he became the greatest coach in football history. With the Wishbone, Bryant went 124, 19-1 and won 3 national championships. There's no question that the Wishbone revived his career and made him the legend he is today. The Bear, using the Wishbone, made Bama Bama. Emory Bellard, while never a great head coach, was a schematic genius, giving us not just the Wishbone, but also the Wingbone. As a high school head coach, he was one of the best, winning 177 games and 3 state titles in Texas. He was eventually inducted into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 1995. Darrell Royal completely changed Texas football when he adopted Bellard's Wishbone. While running the Bone, Royal's Longhorns went 79, 20-2 and won 2 national titles. It could be argued that Royal, using the Wishbone, made Texas football. Texas fans certainly see it that way, as evidenced by their tribute to Royal following his death. On November 10, 2012, in a stadium bearing his name, the Longhorns came out in Royal's favorite formation, and David Ash completed a pass for 46 yards. The perfect tribute to the Wishbone innovator. Fisher DeBerry showed that a military academy could compete at the highest level of football. And when he felt the Wishbone had run its course, he switched to the Flexbone and kept chugging right along. Navy's brief stint as a Wishbone team in the late 80s didn't produce any success, but their implementation of the Flexbone under Paul Johnson and then Ken Niumatalolo kept the Commander-in-Chief trophy in Annapolis for a long time. Johnson even took the Flexbone to Georgia Tech for a few years in the 2000s, even winning the ACC in 2009. While he was at Oklahoma, Barry Switzer was synonymous with the Wishbone. As a head coach, he went 157, 29-4, coaching the Wishbone's only Heisman winner and winning 3 national championships. But the Wishbone isn't completely dead. While it may be a gimmick now, its concepts are still run today. Mike Leach cited its ability to get the ball to players in space as the inspiration for the air raid. The RPO is a form of the triple option. According to Mike Gundy, OU was a Wishbone team as recently as 2019.
They're a Wishbone team, guys. They're just lined up in the spread.
And while that may be an exaggeration, some of its concepts were definitely there. College football has moved on from the Wishbone, but for my money, there will never be anything in all of football more satisfying than a perfectly executed triple option.